Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to Card of the Day, where we take a look at kind of a weird, offbeat, hard-to-use card from the current limited set. And today we're looking at Bringer of the Last Gift. Kind of a weird card, big ol' 8-mana demon that is actually a pretty powerful card. I rated this one pretty low in my initial set review, and I've definitely come up on it after playing it myself, seeing it in play, seeing how the pieces kind of fit together for a deck that uses Bringer of the Last Gift. So let's jump in, how to use it, how I think it's good, and how you want to think about building around this card. So when I look at Bringer of the Last Gift, I see two things. I see a very expensive mana cost, and I see a ability that is very, very powerful, but needs a little bit of setup. Those are the two things that are kind of your barriers to entry, the things you really need to consider. And let's talk about the 8 mana part first and foremost, because that's the biggest part of it, the reason why I think me and a lot of other people, when they first looked at this card, it's like, all right, put it in your back pocket. Maybe there's something here, but 8 mana is a deal breaker most of the time. Most games Unlimited don't just naturally get to 8 mana, 8 lands. You need to be putting ramp creatures in your deck or really slowing down the game, kind of a control game plan, so you can naturally get to 8 mana. But if you do, this card rewards you pretty handsomely. It casts Living Death, or a Living End for those who play Modern, and this effect is super powerful. Ideally, what you're doing is you're wiping your opponent's board, and then you're getting a bunch of your stuff back, and at that point, they have no board, you have a board. It doesn't always work exactly like that, because often you'll have to kill some of your own creatures, or your opponent's going to be getting some stuff back from their graveyard. But the main idea with Living End, Living Death, all these cards is, even though we're both, it's kind of symmetrical, you're losing more stuff than I am on average, and I'm getting back more stuff than you are. And that's the key, right? You want to be getting back more stuff than your opponent is. And so that's the second part of this card that you need to kind of build around. You need to get stuff into your graveyard. So two big hurdles. Really expensive, and you need to be putting stuff in your graveyard so you're actually taking full effect of this Living Death effect. Just a very quick stats, 17 lands pit stop here. Bringer of the Last Gift is currently winning at 57.9 game in hand win rate, which is just to say if you see this card at any point of the game, you win on average about 57.9%. And that's a really good rating for a black card in this set, by the way. Black is the worst color. It means if you look at 17 lands, all the black stats are going to be kind of lower than the other colors. And 57 is pretty good for a black card. However, I will caution that there's another stat here, games not seen win rate, which is 49.7. And this is basically saying when you don't see this card, how often does your deck win? So what this means is that people are playing Bringer of the Last Gift in decks that are built around it. Like I'm kind of advocating you need to build around it. But if you don't find the card, then your deck doesn't do all that much. So you really have to be building around it, and you have to be playing cards that help you find this card, and we're going to get into cards that help you find this card. I just wanted to highlight this is if you're building around Bringer of the Last Gift, and I think you can pick one, pack one this card and build around it. If you're doing so, you need to be able to find the card to actually have a deck that's functional, because it's playing a lot of cards that are just supporting this card alone. Cards that don't do all that much on their own, but really help the Bringer plan. So what do you want for a deck that has Bringer in it? Well, obviously you're going to be base black, because the black card. And while black isn't very good at a lot of things in this set, it's actually very good at slowing down the game. You've got stuff like Deadweight, Deathcap Marionette, Tithing Blade, Join the Dead, cheap interaction, cheap death touch creatures that do make it tough for your opponent to attack you. And that's what you need for an 8 mana card, right? You really need to be slowing down the game, making sure that any amount of your opponent's pressure is blunted to some extent, and black does that pretty darn well. One of the things that black actually struggles with is a way to end the game after it's slowed it down. It can really slow the game to a halt up to turn like 5, 6, and then once you get to like turn 5 or 6, your opponent just starts to play more impactful things, bigger things, starts to outgrind you sometimes, and you're like, well, all of this effort I put into slowing down the game isn't getting me anywhere because I don't have a very good way to actually close out the game. And that's where Bringer is actually a really nice fit for what black wants to do and kind of solving some of black's problems. So you've got all these commons that are very good for the slow down the game attrition plan, and you pair that with Bringer, which is a, oops, I play this and I win the game an overwhelming percentage of the time when I cast it. It actually goes really nicely hand in hand. So I'm looking for these cards, these cheap black cards that slow down the game, death touchers, cheap interaction. Kind of sounds obvious, of course, but this is the core of your black controlling shell. You can pair this with blue, you can pair this with green. I think that those are the colors that pair the best, but I wouldn't be surprised if you could have like a white version of this deck too, or even a red version. The white cards, I think, can play a control role reasonably well, so I don't think it is necessarily just a black-green or a black-blue kind of self-mill thing, but as we're going to get into, I think those are the best 2 color combinations, and probably black-green if I'm to choose one. So apart from cards that slow the game down, you really do want self-mill, cards that mill yourself. So I mentioned Deathcat Marionette. There's a few cards here in green. A card that I kind of described a second ago where it's like, you wouldn't normally play this card, but this really, really does fit the bringer plan really well. In the Presence of Ages, which mills 4 cards, and then returns a creature from your graveyard to your hand, so that can help you find your demon, can help you stock your graveyard. Mineshaft Spider is another good one, just a reach blocker that mills 2. Anything that mills 2, that supports this, like, the cards that are supposed to be there to support the Descend theme, you're going to want to look for those cards. Because the idea with a bringer deck is you're just mill, getting those creatures into the graveyard, but also finding the bringer with something like Presence of Ages, or putting it into the graveyard so you can buy it back later. You're kind of playing on a different axis than most decks in this format would. You're playing this weird game where you're just stay alive, self-mill, and then I eventually just win with the bringer. And of course, what that means is that something like Mineshaft Spider, just a 3/4 reach creature, is going to be pretty good for defending against the multitude of cheap flyers that are in this set. Explore creatures also play pretty well here because they, number one, help you hit your land drops, which is really important for when you're trying to cast an 8-mana card, but they also put things in the graveyard, which is also pretty good for bringer. So the green Explore creatures, those are something that I think do play pretty well in this deck. And then the number 1 card maybe I'm looking for at common for this strategy from a synergy perspective is Another Chance. Not only does this mill you, so you're filling up your graveyard again, but it finds the bringer and gets it back once you've milled a bunch of cards, right? It's okay for the bringer to be sitting in your graveyard for a little while, but you do have to bring it back eventually. And Another Chance is perfect because it brings it back. And also just, if you're not winning through bringer, you can win through other ways too, just big creatures. You can bring back your value creatures, your bombs. Another Chance is just naturally going to play well in the types of decks that you would want to put bringer in anyways. But because it fills the dual role of mills you and gets back the bringer, it's really important, and I would play multiple copies. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with 3 or 4 of these in a bringer deck. And if you can't get Another Chance, there's some kind of replacements. Quati Scavenger is pretty good, just buying back something, a permanent from your yard. Even Walk with Ancestors, I don't think this is the one you really want because it's a little bit clunky, but I have played this before in a bringer deck. I do think you need ways to get the bringer back from your graveyard, because if you're self-milling, and you happen to mill it and you don't have any ways to get it back, then you're not really accomplishing what your deck needs to do, right? I do think you need, I would say, 3 or 4 virtual copies of the bringer in cards like the ones I have here that buy stuff back from the graveyard. In Modern, the way that people play Living End is they just have, their deck is just full of cycling cards, and they just go cycle, and turn 1, 2, 3, and they cast their big reanimate effect eventually. And you can kind of do the same thing here. Cycling creatures do play well. The cycle of expensive dinosaurs that Forest Cycle, Swamp Cycle, those are pretty good cards here, not only just to get a creature in your graveyard, but again, to keep hitting those land drops. And if you're in this space of playing Nurturing Bristleback and Rampaging Spiketail and such, you're of course going to look for the reanimation spells too, Defossilize and Soul Coil Viper. This is a nice little package here. And of course, this is really nice with the self-mill, because you don't just need to find your cyclers. Usually it's like, oh, like the cyclers are really what I want to be reanimating. It's the biggest thing I can get into the graveyard quickly. But if you're self-milling yourself and you have some pretty good creatures in there, it's not that rare to just defossilize something really good on turn 5, even if you haven't cycled it. I will point out that these reanimation effects don't actually work with Bringer, because Bringer says if you cast this card, you get this effect. So a little bit of, disappointment there potentially. But of course, these cards, like you mentioned, still do play pretty well in a deck that wants Bringer. And then to close this out, I have an example deck here. And this is a deck I actually had for the Arena Open. This was a sealed deck, funny enough. I opened up a Bringer of the Last Gift sealed deck where I just have 3 Mineshaft Spiders in the Presence of Ages. I've got some cycling creatures. I've got ways to buy the Bringer back from the graveyard. This doesn't have every single piece I would like for this deck. I'd maybe like another way to buy back the Bringer and a little bit more cheap early defense, but you can kind of get a sense of this is the kind of shell you're looking to put it in. And that's all I have to say for Bringer of the Last Gift. Like I said, I really do recommend trying this card out. It's pretty sweet, pretty fun. You sometimes get it passed to you in pack 1, so you don't even need to use the first pick on it sometimes. If you have a card you'd like me to talk about, like me to go into depth like I did with this card today, please let me know. I'll be doing a bunch of card of the days as the weeks go on, and I hope to see you next time. See you, everybody.